Welcome to the Thriving Leaders podcast, where we dive into real conversations that help leaders grow, teams flourish, and organisations thrive. I'm your host, Claire Gray, Leadership and Team Facilitator at Thriving Culture. I'm also the author of Thriving Leaders, Learn the Skills to Lead Confidently, and Thriving Teams, When Teams Unite, Align and Achieve. This podcast is filled with practical tools, tips, actions, and insights that you can immediately apply so you can lead confidently. I interview thought leaders from across the globe. I hope you enjoy the podcast. You know those people who walk into a room and don't just bring energy, they spark it in others. That's how I describe Rebecca Sutherns. Rebecca has been described as having a warm, wise energy, and I have to say this is very, very true. But more than that, I've experienced myself when she facilitates, she sparks something in you, something around curiosity or feeling a bit more courageous, or even the fact that you have the confidence to do the next thing and that momentum that comes. Rebecca is a trusted advisor, bestselling author, master facilitator, and certified coach with more than 25 years of experience, helping leaders embrace what's next. She gets them aligned on what matters most. Whether it's personal reinvention, transition, organisational transformation, strategy, or sector-wide collaboration. Rebecca doesn't just share ideas, she creates moments that move people. And I'm in awe of her facilitation as a facilitator myself, because I really see the moments where she helps shift people, whether that's individuals or groups as well. So I'm so thrilled to have Rebecca on the Thriving Leaders podcast. Welcome, Rebecca.
What a kind introduction. Thank you so much, Claire. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, me too. So for my listeners who aren't familiar with your work, tell us a bit about your story. So how do you describe what you do and why it matters?
I am a facilitator at heart. I love group collaboration, and I'm good at helping groups of people reach their objectives together. And so the way I do that is by helping organizations and groups of organizations reimagine their next chapter. So that involves I think about it as helping everyone watch the same movie. You know, if you've got a picture in your head of what you mean when you say something and someone else uses similar words, but you just have this sense that the movie showing in their head is different than the one showing in yours. The job that I do is kind of helping everybody make visible to everyone else the highlights of the movie they're watching so that they can get aligned behind what it is that they're trying to do. So I love to do that with organizational strategic planning. I mostly work with mission-driven organizations. So those could be private sector or public or nonprofit, but it's those that really want to align what's most important to them with what they're actually doing. And I'm in year 28 of that. So it's been happening for a bit. And really enjoying the newest sort of iteration of what I'm working on, which is leveraging imagination as a strategy tool.
I love that. I love the metaphor about the movie that's playing in each other's heads, because I feel like, especially when you're working across organizations like you described, but even within organizations, people have different perspectives or perceptions of what the situation or even what the challenge is. So what are some ways that you help people get on the same page or start watching the same movie?
Part of it is recognizing that how important it is to have diverse perspectives on a team. So what I'm not doing is trying to kind of make everybody the same. But what I do notice is that, first of all, diversity on teams is only useful if we can actually leverage it, if we can give people an opportunity to speak and participate out of the diversity of their experience. So that's part of it, is creating conversations and experiences where people's diverse perspectives can actually be shared. That is part of it. And also another part of it is helping people make sure that when they're using the same language and vocabulary, they are meaning the same things by it. Because I think sometimes groups and teams can assume that they are in agreement because they're using the same labels for things. But by digging a step or two underneath that, you start to realize that, if you're using the word respect and so am I, neither of us are going to argue that respect isn't important, but maybe respectful behavior for you is different and feels and looks, and you'd recognize it differently than I would. And so there's some kind of common words that I find teams just throw around as if everybody understands them. And yet what they're actually picturing is different. So I try to get people to talk about the behaviors that they want to see and other kind of really detailed things rather than talking just in sort of values. And values are important, don't get me wrong. But if you and I both said we value respect, integrity, and accountability, sure, who doesn't? But how that actually shows up in our team's behaviors, that's what I'm interested in, aligning for people. And so that's how we do it, is by saying, what would you see? What would you actually see if we were awesome at that? Or what is the kind of future we're trying to co-create? What would it look like? What would you notice? How would things be different? And so just creating spaces where people can either talk about or even draw or create in some other way shared pictures of that desired future. Because once you have articulated and described it together, you're much more likely to be able to get there.
There's like two paths. I feel like I'm at a crossroad because I want to talk about the team behaviors, because I think being really explicit about what you observe, and I think also when you invest that time around the relationships and behaviors, it makes the work a lot easier to achieve. And then also what I'm hearing from you is getting really clear on the picture that we're painting for the future so we can actually work out how we're going to get there, and being really explicit with what that actually looks and feels like. So what path would you like to go on? Do you want to talk about teams and behaviors, or would you like to talk about the strategy?
Well, let's talk about that shared vision of the future first, because I think what I notice is that if I talk about visioning, for example, with a team, which isn't necessarily a word I use all that often, it's because people picture like a vision statement and they go into editing mode, that somehow we're writing a statement that's going to go on their office wall. And it's almost like you tap into the wordsmithing and editorial part of your brain, when really what we need is that rich, vivid picture that creates a feeling for people of saying, this is the kind of organization or world or team that we want. And so I'm a real fan of, sometimes what I'll do is I'll say to people, instead of just sketching it almost like in pencil on the back of a napkin, color in the shading and the detail and the, so that we literally can almost taste it. That's the level of detail that will help a group go, oh yeah, I want that too, because it's really motivating. But it can also reveal points of difference, which is helpful too, where someone can say, that's really interesting. That's not the future I want at all, actually. And I'm really interested in going in this other direction. And it just opens up really good conversations. And that's where some of that relational behavioral stuff comes in. So we can get to there too.
And what's interesting is, I imagine, and what I notice with teams as well, is you'll have people who are a lot more literal and some who identify as being more strategic and creative. And sometimes that can even be a barrier, or it can be even an opportunity because you've got diverse perspectives and people are looking at things from different angles too. How do you navigate that?
Yeah. I actually love that, because I feel like this idea of painting a shared, vivid picture of a future we want is a space that accommodates multiple kinds of thinking. So if people are really metaphorical and they love imagery, they can find a place in that. If you are really detailed and tactical, then you're going to be the person that's really getting at the details of that picture. And if you're someone who operates at a really high altitude, looking down that long road from a really high altitude place of strategy, even from that high altitude, we can say, like, what do you see from that vantage point? And so we kind of use it as, yes, it is a metaphor, which only appeals to some kinds of thinking. But at the same time, we're looking for so much detail in that metaphor that even the more operational kind of detailed people can enter into that. And I think the important thing about it isn't so much the accuracy of it. We're not trying to get it right. We're trying to create spaces where people can have a conversation about it. So they go, oh, is that actually what we're going after? And sometimes it can be very pragmatic. Like, it doesn't have to be really highly aspirational. It can be very day-to-day. So let me give you an example. I was working with a food security organization. One of the things they did was to run a food cupboard. And I said to them, what's the what's the most important metric of success for you? And they said, the number of people using our food cupboard. Great. I said, do you want, like, tell me on your best day, do you want that number of people using your food cupboard? Do you want it to go up or down? And literally half of the room said up and the other half of the room said down. And that was this beautiful strategic aha moment where you realize that this board of directors had all been looking at the same data for years, some of them, but were interpreting it entirely differently because some of them saw an increased number as a win and some people saw a decreased number as a win. And they hadn't actually ever had that conversation. They just knew that that number was important. And so it's not me necessarily saying, let's draw a picture on the wall together. It's me going, tell me what a really successful month looks like at your organization. And literally at that table, some of them would have said, I'd like to work ourselves out of a job because I don't think people should be hungry. And the other people equally legitimately said, I want our office to be booming with people because I want everyone to know that our service exists and that they can, that they're welcome to come and use it. Both very legitimate views of a successful future. But if that board hadn't ever had that conversation, they're literally working at cross purposes from each other when they didn't mean to be.
And so how do you work with a group that has differing perspectives to actually get to a decision? Because if they're at a stalemate of 50-50 as a starting point, how do you actually get to a decision?
Yeah. I think it does depend on the nature of that stalemate, but let me play with the example we were just talking about. Those two visions of the future are different, but they aren't as contradictory as you might think, because I think people on both sides of that dynamic could also get behind the other side, right? No one in that room is saying, I'm a fan of people going hungry, right? So everyone was saying, you're right, I don't want people to be hungry. But in the meantime, we want them to access the food that they need. So we would love it if our food bank was no longer needed, but while it's needed, we want people to know about it and be able to show up during hours that it's open. So part of what we're doing is trying to use those pictures and find a way of, in a sense, reconciling them. That's one way. But another way, depending on the nature of the conflict, is that from a facilitation point of view, one of the questions that I really love is to talk about how to decide before deciding something. So where people, especially when they're really passionate about something, they want to dive right into the solution or their preferred scenario that they're trying to pitch to the room, And part of my job sometimes is to slow that down enough that we can say, what makes a good idea good in this space? What are you looking for it to, what do we want to be true about the solution we come up with? Because generally we can get a group of people to agree on a set of criteria. It's almost like if you were in a brainstorming session of some kind, your inner voice is constantly critiquing other people's answers, right? You're always going, oh, good idea. Oh, I don't like that. That's a dumb idea, right? There's this inner critic, positive or negative, but there's this narrative that's constantly running. And what I try to do is make that explicit to other people, which can be a bit uncomfortable. But I'm saying, when you look at some ideas that we're putting out there, some of them you think are great and some of them you think are terrible. What makes an idea good for you? What makes an idea terrible for you? And what we're doing is coming up with almost like a rubric for making the decision well before we make it. And I find when people can agree on what makes a good decision good, it's way easier for them to come to a shared decision. If we go straight to decision making, those criteria that are implicit stay hidden, and you feel like you're in conflict with someone when in fact you might just be using a different set of criteria for gauging a good decision. And if you can talk about your criteria before you talk about the decision, it tends to alleviate some conflict.
And so would that be similar to like guiding principles that are going to guide our decision, or is it more purely about what does a good decision look like? Or could it be both?
I feel like those might be the same thing in real life.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Right? I mean, when you talk about guiding principles, I mean, sometimes that's behavioral, right? We're going to, I don't know, not interrupt each other, and we're going to include diverse voices and those kinds of behavioral things. But it could also be we're only going to choose an option here that is, I don't know, it's affordable and it is exciting and it is aligned with our mission. And, there might be 4 or 5 things where you say, this is our first filter. Before we're going to dive into a response, it needs to meet these 5 things that we've agreed on together. And so those could be principal things, but they might also be very tactical, like, it might be something as practical as we have $50,000 to spend on this in the next 6 months. And so whatever solution we come up with has to fit within that budget. And it needs to use the staff we currently have. And we're not going to be hiring any new humans in that 6-month period for this particular project. So it needs to use our current human resources. It needs to fit within a $50,000 budget, and it needs to accomplish XYZ, and we need to be excited about it. If our answer can achieve those 4 things, it makes the short list. And so you're guiding a conversation with people that helps them make explicit what's important to them. And I hope you can hear the difference between that and kind of the cringy sort of facilitation that goes, any idea is a good idea. Just, let's blue sky it and it's like, no, not all ideas are good ideas, actually. Let's talk about what has to be true about them before all of us are going to go, yeah, I could actually get behind that.
Yeah, I love that. It's really interesting. What I'm noticing, probably more when I'm operating as a team coach with leadership teams, is often there's really good discussion that happens, but we're not getting really clear or diagnosing what's the actual problem we're solving, or everyone's perspective of what the problem we're trying to solve is slightly different. How do you help teams get really clear on the problem that they're trying to solve?
Sometimes I think just being explicit about asking that question is really helpful, because people dive into solution mode
really quickly. Yeah.
So part of what we're doing, I don't want to make it sound like facilitation is slow. What it does is it slows people down at the beginning in order to go faster later. And sometimes it is slowing them down enough to say, that's a really interesting idea. What problem are you solving for? So that someone else can say, oh, actually, I think you're right. That's a problem, but I don't think it's the most important problem. I think the thing underneath that is this other thing. And holding the container in which we can have a conversation about what problem are we solving for can be really helpful. And one of the other angles that often comes up is, whose problem is it? What audiences are we accountable to? Because we might be solving a problem in the spaces I work. Sometimes we're solving a problem for, say, a donor, when someone else is going, I want to solve a problem for a client. If I'm a social services agency or something, like, they say they want to be client-centered, but then they're paying really close attention to what the government wants because that's who pays their bills, or what their key donor has identified as a pet project, or they want to be seen by their peers as a really impressive organization, or whatever it is. And so part of it is me saying, tell me who you are trying to impress, or whose life you're trying to make easier by this solution, right? So it's not just what's the problem, but who's it a problem for? And then also, is it your problem to solve? So I work with a lot of federations that have, affiliates or offices across a country, but I'm working with maybe their national office or their mothership in some way, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's a role clarity question of, you are describing something that is a problem in the world, but it is not your problem to solve. It's actually a problem that your local offices need to solve. What piece of that is within your mandate? It's those kinds of questions that I find are quite important. The other thing is not so much just the questions we ask, it's actually making people's responses visible. And I mean that very practically. Like, I have a very hard time facilitating without a marker in my hand, right? So if I'm in a room, or if I'm digitally working on an iPad, I am sketching out what they're describing so that it gives them a second modality almost of going, I hear you say this. In your head, does it look like this? And I'm literally drawing shapes and stick figures. I'm no artist, but it's, are you seeing the relationship between the variables you're describing? Does it look like this, or does it look like this? And then they can go, oh, and sometimes if we're together in a space, they'll hop up and grab the pen and start sketching it out and going, I see it like this. And then someone else comes and adds to that picture. So that's another tool, is to, especially when a group is spinning its wheels a bit and getting a little bit entrenched or stuck, changing the modality can really help. So if it were only doing things out loud orally, what happens if we draw it? Or if people are feeling weird about that, what happens if we, I don't know, sent them out for a walk in pairs? Just go take 10 minutes and literally move your body enough that it changes something in the way we think. And so part of my job is not just giving them kind of strategic insight, but also almost like the methodological scaffolding to help their thinking get unlocked. And sometimes that takes, fresh air and a different kind of set of instructions than just sitting around a table talking at each other, especially when we know each other well. I think that's the other place, is that we can get into Groundhog Day a bit and we don't listen because we assume we know what people are going to say. So when I'm working with teams that are very familiar with each other, it becomes even more important to offer them a different way of relating to each other.
I like that energy shift, because I do think we can fall into patterns of behavior, especially like you've said, with people we know well. Something I like to do when I'm facilitating a strategy session is we'll get outside and there'll be a walking element, especially in that kind of ideating, creating stage as well, where people are more brainstorming, but you want to do it in a free environment out in nature so that you're actually not feeling restricted by the room that you're in as well. Like there's quite a few different kind of layers to that as well. I'm facilitating a session in a few weeks with an executive team, and it is a decision make. Like it's very clear. There's a decision that needs to be made. It's sort of like a yes, no go scenario. But what I find with a lot of leadership teams is maybe we're not always explicit going into a meeting what we're there to do. Whether are we having a discussion, are we getting other people's ideas, or are we actually here to make a decision? But also sometimes teams can deflect because we don't always have all the data, or it's a good, how do you help teams set themselves up so they have the right data and information so they can have a really rich discussion to make a decision? Is there any kind of tips you have around data and information? Because you can have analysis paralysis, and on the flip side, people just are going with their gut intuition, and there's probably some happy medium in between.
Yeah. I think there's two parts of having what you need to make a decision. I think it is the data, and it's also having the right people in the room. So another kind of barrier or delay to decision making can be, let me check with my superiors, right? Whoever it is. So I think part of it is making sure that in a decision making meeting, you actually have the decision makers in the room. And you don't have people that need to go and ask permission or go 14 steps up the food chain to be able to make the decision. Because if you don't have the decision makers in the room, the best you can do is to make recommendations. And at least you want to be explicit. That's what you're doing, is you're coming up together with recommendations that are going to get sent up to those who are actually the decision makers. So that's part of it for me, is making sure we understand what the people in the room have the authority to decide. And if the decision is the driver of the meeting, let's make sure that the attendance at the meeting matches the people that can actually make that decision. Then when we're back on the data, if they need certain information in order to inform the decision, let's make it really easy for them, at their fingertips, sent along with the agenda, right? So you're sending, I don't know, the meeting invitation. It's got the objective of the meeting. Hey, we're going to make this decision. Here's a link to the background information we have. And if you feel like you need any additional information before coming to the meeting in order to make the decision, let us know so that we can fill in that gap before we walk in the room. So part of it is, how do we set them up for success ahead of time? But I think then it is also, and this is where I can get a little bit cheeky, but it's true, is I will say to people, you will never have full information. Like if you can only make a decision in the context of full information, you will be paralyzed forever, because we never have full information. So we are making our best judgments with partial information that we have all the time. And so sometimes I think we can hide behind the desire for full information when in fact that's a bit of an illusion. We never have full information. And so it can become a stall tactic, subconsciously, sometimes unconsciously. People don't always do it on purpose, but I combine hey, we gave you the opportunity to fill this gap. ahead of time. And maybe we're setting ourselves too high a bar in terms of expectations around what we're about to, like what information we can have. And so the way that I make that lower stakes for teams is to say, with the information we have, what decision are we going to make, but also giving people a chance to lower the stakes enough to say, can we pilot something? Can we experiment with something? Under which conditions would we revisit this decision? Like, I promise we're going to revisit it after another quarter, or if we get really relevant new information, we will reopen it. The inference is, if we don't, we won't, right? So we're trying to build good habits of decision making in a team to say there are conditions under which we will reopen this decision, but there's also conditions under which we will not. And we need to live with it for a while, try it out, give it a bit of runway. So part of my coaching with teams is helping them develop good decision-making habits. And part of that is acknowledging that we live in uncertainty most of the time.
I love that, because that's the reality. And I think sometimes it can be a good excuse not to actually make a decision. And also I find sometimes leadership teams will decide not to act or decide not to make a decision, but it's not explicit that, okay, we're actually not going to move forward with this. It kind of just fades away that we didn't actually make a decision. And a decision of inaction is a decision as well, but be explicit that we've chosen not to do this and this is the reason why. Yeah.
I'm a big fan of being explicit. Like, I feel like a lot of the work that I do is helping people say out loud what's already being said in their head and just making it visible to them and to the group. I think that really it's a service to people. And if you don't know, or you're noticing a weird dynamic in the room that you don't quite recognize or can't name very well, I think the candor of being explicit about that and saying, I'm picking up on something here, but I don't even know what it is. Is anybody else noticing this? Or, hey, I know I'm facilitating this meeting, but I'm not sure where to take it from here. And I need 10 minutes to just regroup. Can we take a quick coffee break while I get my head together? I would much rather be explicit that way as well, rather than just being oblivious to it. I feel like I'm on a bit of a crusade against oblivious facilitation, or against, just as you said, letting things just kind of fade away and hoping that people don't notice. I would much rather name it and decide together what to do with it.
Yeah. I know one of the things I do a lot as a facilitator is I'm noticing this. Where do we want to take it? Like, as in put it back to the group rather than deciding myself. But I also think for a leader, it's important to make things explicit. And I think that's where we fall short a lot of the time, and where people are like, oh, I thought we decided this, because at the end of the meeting, we haven't played back. Okay, so we're all on the same page. That this is what's been agreed. And then if there's actually articulating that, and if there's any discrepancies, people have the opportunity then to say, hey, actually, I thought it was this that we just decided, and we can get really explicit with it too.
Yeah. I like using some digital tools for that as well, because sometimes if we use kind of only in what I call an open mic format, where you're just the first person to speak, or the loudest voice or whatever is the one that says, oh, I think it's like this. And then we assume that they're speaking on behalf of the room when they may or may not be. We don't always have time to ask every single person what they think, and it may not feel safe for them to do that. And so I really like relying on a digital tool. Like, I use something called Mentimeter, but you could use lots of them, where people can use their phones, even in an in-person meeting, use their phones and answer a question. And what it does is it shows everybody's answers in real time on the screen, which means that I can, if I'm sitting there assuming that everyone else in the room thinks the same way I do, I now have visual evidence to either prove that or disprove that, because I can see the full range of answers and go, oh, I don't have to out myself because it's anonymous, but I can see that my answer was the outlier and everyone else in the room thinks a different thing, or that there's a huge diversity of opinion in the room, or yes, in fact, we do all think the same way. And so we now have some digital tools we can use that help speed that up without having to put people in the awkward and time-consuming position of each person having to weigh in on something. We can do it anonymously with our phones in 2 minutes and let people kind of see that data visualization together, and they can draw their own conclusions from it. And it isn't only based on the person who was the most comfortable speaking out loud in front of everybody.
It's interesting because I use tools like that when I have a really big group and less so with the leadership team. But even for this decision in a couple of weeks, I'm thinking, actually, I should probably use that to really gauge where people are sitting with the decision. So it's not just, the loudest voice is influencing what's actually happening in the room.
I like it. I mean, sometimes when the group is really small, it is awkward because people will sit there and try to guess who said what or something. If it was highly contentious and the group is very small and well known to each other, I don't know if I would use it. But sometimes when the stakes are very high, using anonymized tools is a way to create some additional safety.
Yeah, and it is a high stakes decision. You mentioned something before around, like, do we have the authority to make the decision? Is this a recommendation or do we actually have the decision-making authority? And I've been reflecting on this a little bit recently because I do a lot of work with executive teams that you're the most senior team in an organization. You feel like you've got the decision-making authority and you also need to go to board to sign off on some decisions too. So sometimes you actually don't have that decision-making authority. And so I wonder whether going with recommendations versus decisions actually changes our psyche in terms of how risky something feels because it might not sit with us. Hearing that, what's coming up for you?
Yeah. I think there's lots of good ways to lower the perception of the stakes of something. And I think that could be one way. I think the other thing that came up for me was almost like the opposite, where people that are at the top of an organizational food chain, they know that the buck stops with them and that they are the decision makers. But sometimes they assume that they know stuff that they don't, in the sense that if they, for example, say they got promoted through the ranks of the organization and the decision they're making is actually something that more frontline people would know more about than they would. If you ask a really senior person something to do with frontline work, they don't very often say, I don't know, let's ask a frontline worker. They tell you what they think. And they're telling you based on their own experience as a frontline worker 20 years ago, or, because they don't want to look like they don't know or that they're out of touch with the reality of life on the ground. And so part of what I'm watching for when I'm working with the most senior of teams is to make sure that they are actually operating out of knowledge they have that's recent, as opposed to almost like pretending they know. And that sounds less charitable than I mean it to sound, but they want to be polite. They want to look informed, and they don't want to pass the buck because there's no one to pass the buck to. But sometimes what I think actually has to happen is that they need to ask more questions, not because they're delegating the decision-making authority, but because they are not the closest to the problem. And so I really love working with leaders that understand the limits of their own knowledge, that even though they happen to be kind of at the top of the organizational food chain and can see a good long distance from a high altitude, if the decision requires detailed knowledge that, ground level knowledge that your local workers really know about, I love it when leaders are humble enough to be willing to ask those folks.
Yeah. And I think so many organizations, especially bigger organizations, stay at head office. They're not going out to see the front line, what's actually happening on the ground, or having those conversations. And that's why I think your people leaders or your middle managers or whatever you want to call them are such a rich data point, because they're often like the meat in the sandwich. They're not involved in decision making, but they really know what's actually happening on the ground. And sometimes we don't always hear their voice as well, which I think is such a missed opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. My radar is kind of up for who's speaking on behalf of whom. And so that's one of the things that I listen for, is that I don't always know the answer, but I will at least ask the question of how close is that person to the issue being addressed, because we all behave in ways that we want to save face and we want to look like we know what we're talking about. And so it's very rare that leaders at the most senior levels will say, actually, I don't know that. They're much more likely to answer the question as if they know. And as an outsider to that team, I don't always know if I can take their word for that or not. And I don't want to not trust their word. And it's not that they're trying to be untrustworthy, but there's a big distance between their day-to-day experience and the question they're being asked. And I really appreciate it when somebody's willing to say so.
Yeah. I think calling that out is important. You mentioned earlier as well that you do a lot of work like cross-functionally or a multi-team or multi-organization or multi-associations. And I feel like that also is about getting diverse voices and views and actually fingers on the pulse. How do you work with the system? Because I guess everyone's coming from different perspectives. What do you see as the biggest challenges when you're working cross functionally?
Mhm. Yeah. It takes a certain amount of courage, right? For people to be willing to pull back the curtain and be vulnerable and share information across a system. And yet, at the same time, if I said to, and let me use a concrete example. I facilitated a session a couple of years ago where in a region of, I live in Canada and it was a region near where I live, they wanted to really address affordable housing. And so they pulled together a whole bunch of people that have one part of that affordable housing story. So they had landlords and real estate developers. They had people who had experienced directly of being homeless. They had social agency staff, they had elected officials, they had funders all in the room together. And so they had about, I don't know, maybe 120 people in a room for 2 days, and my job was to facilitate that conversation. Really complex from an event design point of view, but incredibly rich because you mentioned earlier what happens if you don't have full information. We actually, it wasn't written data that we were bringing into the room, but it was lived data that we were bringing in and saying we actually want everyone in the room that we could think of who might have a perspective on this issue that's different from what you would typically get. And so I love that because most of the problems that we're trying to solve don't organize themselves neatly by organization or by team or by department, right? And so if you think about that, you're like, well, of course, like we are not the only people tackling whatever challenge we're talking about. We're not the first people to have ever thought of this. Who else knows something about this? And if we actually want to tackle changing systems in a community, we need to get multiple people that are involved in that system. And so I've been involved in some meetings where it's multiple boards, for example. But that's tricky because there's a certain element of protecting the mission or the existence of their organization. And so my interest is in helping boards, for example, perceive their role as advancing the mission of the organization they represent. So if that organization, say, is about affordable housing, that board is accountable primarily for providing affordable housing more than it is for protecting the existence of that one organization that happens to be a housing provider. And so if we can kind of lift people's gaze a little bit and say, what is this really about? I think they can get quite excited about it because it's meetings where they feel, if they're well run, they can feel like they can actually make progress because for a change, people aren't saying, oh, I have to go check with so and so. It's like, nope, that person's here too. We can ask them. And I love that. It's kind of exciting, but it takes a certain amount, as I said, a certain amount of courage, willingness to carve out time, willingness to share the risk and share the bill. So there's lots of things about it that aren't straightforward, and sometimes I do it with existing coalitions. So it's not always that I'm convening, let's get all the affordable housing providers in a room. Sometimes it is that our government, or I'm thinking about in the area where I live, we have what's called an immigration partnership. And it's anybody that's involved in serving newcomers. They're already part of a council, or we have health teams that are like that, where you have representatives from the hospitals and the community health centers and allied health professionals. They already meet together. So sometimes it's not convening like a temporary task force of people. Sometimes it is just working with existing multi-stakeholder coalitions. And in that case, I think it becomes really important to talk about decision rights because too often, like the dialogue itself is easy. It's the decisions that are hard.
Yeah, because I guess everyone's got an opinion and everyone's got a view, and they're all probably quite passionate as well. Because to me, it's making progress on those adaptive leadership challenges that you're talking about and getting everyone from the system and all the different factions and beliefs in a room to actually have the dialogue that needs to happen to reach a decision. But that can be tricky as well because that's when people are acting politically. There's losses. People feel emotionally attached to the work that they're doing as well. And so sometimes actually lifting, like you said, the gaze so that people actually are focused on actually the problem that we're all here to solve can help mobilize people. But it's tricky. It's challenging.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I love the uncertainty of that and the complexity of it, but it's not fun for most people. So they don't even want to convene the meeting because they can't even imagine how, like, I think they picture it just being this, chaotic free for all, and it's going to just get completely out of control. And I don't feel like that at all. I mean, that's part of my job, is to put some structure around that so that it doesn't go completely off the rails. And I think the other thing that brings up for me is that there's a writer named Adam Kahane, and he has several books that I really appreciate, but one of them is called Collaborating with the Enemy. And he talks about how you don't have to agree on everything to be able to make some progress on some things, right? On some shared objectives. And so part of it is that candor and the explicitness we talked about earlier, where I might be able to say, and partly I can get away with it because I'm outside of the dynamics of the room in some ways, but I can say, hey, I can see and hear some points of disagreement and some points of agreement. And I can literally grab a marker and draw that up and go, looks like we don't agree on these things, but it looks like we do agree on these. And we're trying to solve this problem over here. And do we have enough agreement to move forward on this thing? And sort of part of our job as facilitators is to direct people's attention to the right things at the right times. And so sometimes we can say, I realize that you don't necessarily agree on everything and you may not even like each other, but do we agree on enough to make progress on this one thing? Because that's what we're here to solve today. And so we're redirecting people's frustration, their energy, their attention to something that is shared, and that they can agree on that small thing. And it's kind of a negotiation tactic as well, right? Where you figure out what you can agree on even when you can't agree on everything.
Which helps to move people forward. And I think sometimes when we're a leader in the system, it can be challenging to do that because we come from a viewpoint as well. And so that's why promoting facilitators, but sometimes it's great having someone who doesn't have an opinion or a view who can help kind of navigate the conversation to help you get to a resolution or an outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I say that to people. I mean, it's not just that I'm so-called neutral. I'm not sure that I am. But what I can be is I can get away with saying stuff that they can't, right? Like I can, and partly it's because I'm sort of naive and new, and be like, so why do you do things like that? Like I can ask them and I can get away with it because I'm new. It's sort of like being the new hire, right? You've got about 6 months to be able to ask the questions that are harder to ask later. But it's also because I've got a certain level of respect or power or whatever it is in the room that gives me a bit of currency. And I don't want to inappropriately lord that over people, but I can at least get away with, like, I've had a lot of clients that say, I've said what you've been saying, and no one heard me, and then you say it and they hear you. And I hate that dynamic. It's not something I'm really proud of, and it's not personal. But when you bring somebody in from the outside who notices something, it sits differently than if that internal voice has been saying it over and over again. And so the fresh eyes and the combined with the candor is actually part of the perspective that people are paying for, I think, when they hire me.
Yeah, definitely. I was speaking to an executive yesterday who said something that stuck with me, and I was keen to explore it with you. It was about how strategy is moving so much quicker than it ever has before. And they're working through the strategic direction with AI. And that he said, in the past we'd have years to kind of percolate on things and make decisions. And then we'd have a roadmap for the next 3 to 5 years. Whereas we've got 6 weeks to make a decision and move quickly, and just with the pace of change happening around us. How are you responding to this pace of change, and how does that influence strategy execution?
Yeah, I mean, and you've nailed it, I think, Claire. Like, it is the pace of change that is accelerating like crazy. And it goes back to when we were saying about being able to live with making decisions with imperfect information. It's a bit like that, where we can't keep up. And part of how I come to terms with that is acknowledging that we can't. So trying to get all of the information and trying to move at the pace of data and technology is beyond us, right? What do we have to do? We have to use good judgment. We have to be adaptable. We have to be willing to make decisions based on explicit assumptions, but knowing that they are partial. And I remember somebody during the pandemic saying to me, oh, well, I don't do digital. And what slipped out of my mouth was happy retirement. Because I said, you don't get to use that, right? And it makes me think of people that kind of want to like keep their head down until the waters get calm compared to the people that learn to surf, right? And I think we need people who learn to surf because the context, the volatility is not going away. The pace of change is not slowing down. So we need to kind of just get right in there and be willing to be adaptive and dynamic in it as opposed to waiting for the dust to settle and then making a decision. And it's very stressful. I mean, I do adaptability coaching and there's a particular tool we use called AQAI and it measures people's adaptability quotient. But it's not about becoming more adaptable necessarily. It's about figuring out which adaptability tools in your toolkit are easiest for you to use. So when you're asking about how to help people live in this dynamic environment, that's one of the ways that I help them is by saying, you don't get a choice about adapting. You have to, but you do get a choice about which tools you use to become more adaptable or to adapt to what's facing you. And I can give them kind of a toolkit of 15 different ways that people are adapting. And if we can help them identify which ones are already easy for them. So one might be big picture thinking, another might be grit, another one might be the support of your team. There's a bunch of them. And if they can say, oh, I can use that one in my sleep, like that's really easy for me to rely on my team. I love my team. It's like, great, that's a tool you can use to be adaptable. You might struggle with being extroverted, for example, which is another way to adapt more easily. You might not be an extroverted or you might not show up that way as a leader, but you might love your team support and you might be really, really good at unlearning things. So why don't we lean into that? And so for me, because there are lots of ways to be adaptable, I think the service I can provide is helping people figure out which tools in their adaptability toolkit are easiest for them to use. And when they do, the data shows that they actually enjoy adapting. They're energized by it as opposed to being completely exhausted by it if we're being asked to adapt using tools we can't stand and don't align with what we're good at.
I love it because it's essentially taking a strengths-based approach and leaning to things that already energize you so that you can be adaptable, because we can't just like stand still. We need to adapt, change, pivot, all the cliche words that are going around as leaders, and we need to help our people as well be able to adapt too with the amount and speed of change that's happening.
Yeah, exactly. So if I can use that kind of tool, like this AQAI tool works for teams as well as for individuals. And if I can use that tool to kind of hold up a mirror to a team and say, hey, look, you have an interestingly high number of people on this team that are, they're really mentally flexible. They've got really good cognitive flexibility. They can see lots of ways to solve a problem. That's a superpower of your team. Let's use that to adapt. And most often people look at me and go, that's a thing. Like it's so ingrained in them. It's so baked in that they don't even notice that it's a gift that they have. And so if we can kind of show them what they're great at already and make that explicit to them and go, this is a way to adapt. You don't need to kind of separately adapt or learn a whole new skill set. You already have existing, easy wiring that is going to help you do this. And I'm finding that can be a really hopeful message for teams.
Yeah. Awesome. So Rebecca, if you could leave our listeners with one message about thriving teams, what would that be?
Oh, one message is always hard for me, but one of the quotes that I really appreciate it's attributed to Peter Drucker. I'm not sure if it really was him or not, but he said, the best way to predict the future is to create it. And I think that's the message I'd like to leave your listeners with, is that this isn't about being psychic, being accurate predictors of the future so that you can respond to it. It's about recognizing that, yes, you can adapt to whatever comes. You've got some resilience around that. But even more than that, you have the ability to create and shape the future. And some of that brings us full circle right back to what we talked about at the beginning about painting a really vivid shared picture of the future you want to create, because we do have a role in shaping what the future is like rather than just having to react to it or somehow predict it accurately. So the best way to predict the future is to shape it.
Love it. Thank you so much, Rebecca. I've really enjoyed this conversation, as I always do. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. It's great to talk to you. I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks very much.
What an awesome conversation with Rebecca. I loved every minute of it. One of the things I particularly loved is this idea of helping everyone watch the same movie. It sounds so simple, but really, when you realize how dysfunction in teams and organizations happen, the fact that potentially that we're actually looking at the same situation differently and not even using the same language as a lens to get on the same page. And unless someone creates that space to make that really explicit, whether that's a facilitator or the leader, you end up working really hard and potentially you might be actually saying the same thing. I also really love Rebecca's point about deciding how you're going to decide before you make the decision. And I talked about how I had an exec team high stakes decision coming up. And I've actually had that meeting since doing the podcast. And we did this and it made such a huge difference to the conversation. They reached a decision way quicker because we worked out how we were going to decide first. So get a group or a team to agree on the criteria first or those guiding principles before they dive into that debate and what the options might be. It definitely helps to reduce conflict and help to move things forward. I loved also the point that Rebecca made about not always having the full information. So if your team is waiting to have the perfect data before you act, it might be something you're avoiding or stalling. The better question is, with that information that we do have, what's our best next move? And the thing that's really stayed with me since chatting with Rebecca was her final takeaways. The best way to predict the future is to create it, not to wait for the dust to settle, not to react once things become clearer, but to paint a vivid, shared picture of the future that you want and start building towards it. And I really think that gets missed a lot in strategy creation and then execution. Thanks for joining us at the Thriving Leaders podcast. If you'd like to find out more about our leadership programs, facilitation, keynote speaking, or executive or team coaching, head to our website, www.thrivingculture.com.au. This is also where you can sign up for our newsletter, where I share useful tips on leadership and team development, as well as our podcast. You can also grab a copy of either of my books on our website, and it's also available on all good online retailers, including Audible, Spotify, and Kindle. If you like this episode, I'd be so grateful if you left a 5-star review, as it helps us reach more people and therefore helps more leaders thrive. Please subscribe.